exemplary, and I think only a true blue Goan can do it. Okay. So all right, so before we launch into any kind of a conversation, I'd like to share some things with you. I've known Arundhathi for the last 30 years now, and it's been a long journey as friends and as a reader and as a critic of Arun's works. So there might possibly be moments where, we share things which might not really always be visible as apparent or obvious. Please bear with us, but also sort of participate in the full flush of a friendship that's now come to such a wonderful juncture. Arun, I'd actually like to start off by asking a really predictable and a completely half-asked question. Love without a story. I expect a full-asked answer.
You expect what?
No half moons, 2 full moons. A full-asked answer.
I will do my best. I'm going to actually answer by quoting from a poem in the book, which is a cycle of poems called The Fine Art of Aging. And that's in fact where the title comes from. So whenever people ask me why love without a story? Am I holding it wrong? Possibly. When people ask me about the title, there are 2 responses I have. One is to actually talk about the title, which I could do. But the other, which is a shorter response, which I'm going to opt for, is just to quote from that particular poem, which says, "For lovers flatten into photographs, photographs into reminiscence, reminiscence into quiet. And then, what's left? Perhaps just the oldest thing in the book. Love without a story."
Quite amazing. I mean, the abiding image that one is left with is what one might call a series of continuums. A journey that seems to never ever end. And in all the memories that I have of you, and when I recollect your journey or sort of try to make sense of it, one of the most abiding metaphor that one might want to take recourse to is the metaphor of sadhana, of course, but also the image of the sadhavi, a person who is constantly trying to sort of imagine and participate in a quest. And the more I think about you, Arun, and the more I look at you now, I realize that there is this constant desire to move. You're sitting now, of course, and there's a great amount of stability that I experience when I behold you. But there is always this, I won't call it chanchalta, but there is this desire to constantly ask yourself these eminently difficult questions, and to then use these questions and the process of asking these questions as a vehicle to move ahead. And I ask you this also because it's fairly obvious to all who have followed your career that apart from poetry, there is this side that you have to your multifaceted personality, which is to do with mapping a certain kind of transcendence. And I refer here to your book on the Buddha, your book on Sadhguru, and your book with Sadhguru, and of course the anthology as well, Bhakti Poetry. So I'm just sort of wondering about this as a possible way of coming to terms with this uneasy very sort of unpredictable energy that you seem to possess, and you seem also to transmit through very, very economic and precise words and phrases in your poems. That's number one. And number two, yes, just as a compliment. Okay, one also finds that, I mean, Sachidanandan talks about how there is this ambivalence in your poetry, but on the contrary, one really feels that in a lot of your oeuvre, the spiritual and the visceral do not really come across as contradictory. Categories. In fact, oftentimes you realize that a lot of your poetry is spiritual only because it is so physical, it is so corporeal, right?
That's lovely.
Arundhathi Uvach.
Arriba. I loved that. I love the way in which you summed that up, the second part of things. And I must say that I actually found, and since this is an intimate enough conversation, I think one can say this, I actually found that as my own spiritual life deepened, as it took on a certain urgency, I actually found that the poems were growing much more erotic, much more overtly erotic. Earlier, the eroticism was more implicit. The sensuousness was there because I think the image has been important. But the more flagrant eroticism actually happened as that journey deepened. So in my own experience, these two are not separate. And then I uncovered for myself this wonderful tradition of bhakti poetry, which corroborated that and celebrated that. And to me, it didn't seem like they were pointing towards a contradiction, because in my own small way, I was experiencing it. And I was experiencing that these are completely artificial divides. That if there is anything that we can call spiritual, it cannot be undertaken by some sliver in one's cerebral cortex, that it has to actually percolate right down to your bones and your marrow. It's about all of you. It's not about some amputated, rarefied part of you, you know? So that's in response to your second question. What was the first? If you were to distill it into a question, was it a question?
No,
the quest.
The quest.
I think when you knew me, and when I see people, Jerry here and Ranjit couldn't make it, but when I'm thinking about the early days that we spent at the Circle, when we first met, yes, I was probably a fairly feverish seeker even then. I was. And I think the paradox is that as my life now grows more geographically hectic, I'm in multiple places, I'm often between places. That's the way my life has been since 2010, in a way that was unplanned. But that has happened. But as it grows more geographically frenetic, I actually feel more anchored than I ever felt when we first met, all those years ago. Because it's not that I've ceased to be a seeker, but I think I've moved from being a seeker at large to a more committed seeker. I think there is a sense of a path that I can call my own, and an unfolding path which has deepened. And so there is less, and that's in a sense to come to the book and the fine art of aging, which is the cycle of poems that I see as central to the book. There is a particular kind of traveler in this book. My earlier book was called When God is a Traveler. And that was also talking about another kind of traveler, not perhaps a little more of the chanchal traveler that you talked about. That's the Muruga. That's the mythic character of Kartikeya or Muruga or Subramania, as he's called. He goes off on this journey around the world. He goes through his own series of ordeals and adventures and travails. And he eventually returns to find that his answers are to be found back home. This is an age-old story to be found in mythology all over the world, the story from innocence to experience. With this book, I feel that the kind of journey that's happening is different because the character central to this cycle of poems is a woman called Avvaiyar. Avvaiyar is an ancient figure herself, in more ways than one. She is an ancient figure in Tamil Nadu. She is also an ancient woman. She's a crone. And she fascinates me because she's a woman traveler, she's a vagabond, she's a mendicant, and she's a woman who voluntarily chooses old age. Now, what kind of person would voluntarily choose old age, yeah? So that became, I think, my central question in these poems. As I age too, I think these are inevitable questions, but perhaps I had questions about aging and death a long time ago as well, as some of you will remember. But that became central, and I began to realize, Abhay, as I wrote these poems, this was not a premeditated thing. Yeah? So you start because you're fascinated, and then you're scratching the page in some way to see where it'll go. And I began to realize the kinds of journeys that Avvaiyar represents. And to me, she represents the kind of traveler who is not looking for a point. She's not looking for a purpose. She's no longer traveling to make a deal. She's no longer traveling to extract meaning. She's not making a pilgrimage. She's not doing that. She has kind of figured out that there is, as she says as I say in these poems, she says, there is no point. She says the only point, the point, if any, is a shared fruit and laughter, and that there's no sadly or happily ever after. Wow. She's figured that out. And she's not here for an invitation, she says. I'm not looking for an invitation. I'm not looking to make a bargain. And it's the last line of the poem that I think sums up my own personal aspiration, most of all. She is, I say in this poem, she's unhurried, forever out of step, always on time. That's the kind of woman I'd like to be.
So wonderful, as always, Arun. So love without a story is really a map of a pilgrimage without a center. Would one dare call it that?
That would be an interesting way of calling it,
yes.
Yeah, of terming it. I mean, there are all kinds of pilgrimages talked about in this book.
Absolutely.
So I think
Yes.
Jerry was the one who asked me this question at Kitab Khana. He said there are several stories in the book.
Right.
So why do why love without a story? But my whole point was that the stories here are almost
Fractured.
trampolines from which you want to leap off into something else.
Right,
So the story is a trigger more than anything.
Absolutely. Why don't we read out? That would be wonderful if you could.
So this is Avvaiyar. I'm glad you opened to that page. So this is Avvaiyar who chooses not to lead this life of constantly hankering for youth. Those of you who know, of course, of this particular character in Indian mythology, Yayati, whom we are told constantly yearns for youth. So Avvaiyar says that is not her quest. She says she doesn't want to be a conqueror of free radicals, victor of fine lines, high on a sun's sacrifice, women, fine wines, collagen, spirulina, vitamin E, macadamia nuts, extracts of green tea, triclosan, selenium, propylene glycol, alpha hydroxy acids, bergamot, retinol. Avvaiyar makes another choice. Fearless friend to peasants, fearless friend to gods, ally of peasants. She walks the streets alone. And on such a path, she says, it's best to be a crone. And so I will read a couple of sections from the cycle of about 7 poems. And she says I'm just reading you a small extract where she says, Avvaiyar's done, where I say, Avvaiyar's done with the ooze and cream. Avayar's done with the soggy dream of being kissed awake by love. She's so light, she can finally take herself seriously. Avayar lives in a face where the civil war is almost over. Frayed flags of peace hoisted, cavalry slumbering, garrison emptied. Nothing to declare anymore, she says, not even nostalgia. Avayar knows that tyrannical algebra teachers die, and timid cleaning ladies with floral aprons too. She knows oligarchic poets flatten. She knows oligarchic poets blur into fussy grandpas. Dashing bankers get dementia. And the prettiest girls in class slash their wrists in beach homes, felled by boredom and barbiturates. She knows the aging ustad is eventually ousted by triglycerides and court politics, and the silent acolyte with smoldering eyes and humid palms. She knows that every court must have its oily pandit, its bleating groupies, its sullen cavillers, its jester stoned on his own demagoguery. She knows every sangha has its devadatta plotting his coup in a blue swirl of power lust. She knows that everyone, everywhere, believes they've been wronged, that history was written by someone else, and that they're always right.
Truly, truly moving and profound at the same time, Arun. Just sort of, maybe before we sort of open it up to the audience, I mean, how do you finally assemble in your consciousness the shape of the struggle that the poet frames for you? It's a general question that I ask myself. How do you make sense of the fights that the poet is engaged in the course of writing a poem? And I mean, one of the things, this is a question I guess most of us as readers try to answer in our own fractured way. I mean, one of the things that I find you constantly sort of coming eyeball to eyeball with is I mean, apart from the larger philosophical issues, it's also about a certain sort of attitude that you want to strike, in the most sincere way, of course, to and with this proposition of nostalgia. And I'm not talking about this particular poem. I'm talking about a whole host of other poems which are there in this book and in the earlier books. So you have a certain recognition, a certain acknowledgement, but at the same time a certain distrust of nostalgia. So the question that I see as a reader of your poetry is this sort of desire to control the over-sentimental, as it were, providing you a vector to sort of to shepherd the poem along all its various vectors. So the poem, in fact, seems to happen often in the space between the pull and the push. So you often sort of delineate all the different problems that you experience. You, as in the poetic voice, the protagonist. And that is when you see, as a viewer, as a reader, as a witness, the poem happening. Is that something that you have? I'm sure you've given it a thought about the kriya, the prakriya, the process. And I remember at Poetry Circle constantly thinking about and talking about the accent on articulating the process. Is this something that you have, you would like to hold forth on?
I'm not sure I can hold forth on it. I'm actually just listening to what you're saying at this point, because that's not how I formulate it for myself.
Sure.
But how I do formulate it, the part that resonates with me, so I'm trying to go back to an earlier poem called Home, which was from my second book, where there is a deep need for home. Much of that book, Where I Live, is about looking for belonging. And yet there is a need to say, as that poem does, give me a home that isn't mine. So it is about negotiating this whole cargo of memory that can sometimes be oppressive.
Right.
And at the same time saying, all of this seems quite interesting if I just decide that I'm visiting it. I'm visiting this space, clogged with memory. I'm visiting it, and I'm going to leave fairly soon. I'm a good visitor to have. I take good care of this house. When I see myself like that in that poem, it became a more habitable space. And it actually ends with the lines, a home like this body, so alien when I try to belong, so hospitable when I decide I'm just visiting. And that's with Home, which was a poem that was written in 2001, and I feel in many ways prefigures many of the concerns that have perhaps shown up later. Interestingly, it's been in my last two books that mythic figures have become so central.
Right.
And they come up front as really archetypal figures. Shakuntala in the last one, Murugan in the last one, and Avayar here. And I'm looking forward to discussing that with you tomorrow, Amrita, because I see that very much in her work. I think I would allow myself mythic figures now because they don't seem weighty. They don't have weight. So it's not, I'm coming back to your question of looking to the past. The past seems much less burdensome, much less burdensome. In fact, there seems to be a greater ability to pare this figure down to what really counts, which is nuts and bolts and its magnificent skeletal structure, these figures, you know. I wouldn't have been able to do it earlier because I feel I was actually dealing with weight, the weight of the past in some ways. There's less of that. There's the past, but much less weight. Is this sounding mystical? I'm trying to make sense of this difficult question that he's asked. I don't mean it to sound...
Not at all. On the contrary, I think you've really addressed it in very substantial ways. Absolutely. But on that note, I think you should read a poem. And I'm thinking mainly when I'm asking you these questions, about your poems on loss and about death. You know, I was struck by your poem after the death of your father. And also, I think the poem which is dedicated to Anand, I think, about the deletion of the sunset. So these are just few of the poems that I can recollect at the moment, but a whole host of poems where I find you again, you know, trying to come to terms with all what the past brings in its wake, as it were. And that seems to be an operating vector, you know, which sort of seems to sort of invest energy as far as your voice is concerned, and your way of throwing your voice is concerned.
Yeah. I think, you know, loss has been there very much in the earlier poems as well, but I feel the way in which these poems are dealing with loss is kind of different. When I read those poems, they don't feel heavy to me. And yet they're not... they're not about some easy sunlight. They're not about easy sunlight at all, but there is a certain openness. There is a kind of there are more perforations, I often say in my poems now. They're more porous, and that allows them to breathe much more. They're less happy perforations. They're not osteoporosis. It's not osteoporosis at work. It's a happier perforation. What would you like me to read one of those?
Yes.
Or would we like to just throw this open to I can read a poem at the end if you'd like conversations. Would you like to talk?
Maybe after this poem.
Yeah. Anant or the father poem? Father poem. Yeah, okay. It's Finding Dad, 14. Abhay has told me I must stand up and read.
Did I say that?
I'm afraid you did.
Okay.
So I will.
Please.
Father poems demand it. Finding Dad. When parents die, you hunt for clues in strips of sorbitate, immaculate handwriting, unopened cologne, and in evening air, traces of baritone. You believe they must add up to a story larger than the one you knew, larger than the face that looked up abstractedly from a book, sovereign, mysterious, while a cricket commentary crackled inanely on a television screen. Until you discover the old fallacy. The dots never joined. The clues never worked. That even when they were around, parents were always piecemeal, themselves just a clue. And the only way to their center is the secret way, past the epidermis of things, the carnival path of self-forgetfulness. Always has been. And so, when fathers disperse into fire and ocean and sputtering sky, into Ferris-wheeling limb and splintering desire, there's no following, except through dance, the great charring dance in which they stand revealed, divested, fallible, whole. Whole in the body's gentle democracy, whole in the heart's stubborn partisanship that you knew as love, your dad's crazy love. That was the wrong time to hold it up. Not the right time. But we have 8 minutes left if there are conversations.
Last time, after we met, and when I went home and I read them, I really wanted your voice because on the page it didn't have the same quality as when you read them out.
I think that's also because we've all forgotten how to read poetry, really. I mean this. I really do think that a voice is really an invitation to read the poem. You can make it your voice if you feel called to do that. If you don't, it's fine. I would say thank you. I'm glad that you felt that way. And I'm not saying that the only life of the poem is on the page. It certainly lives in the spoken word, which is the only reason I agree to festivals. It certainly lives in the spoken voice. But there is also a way to read a poem on a page. And I fully understand there are those who tell me, I wish we hadn't heard your voice. I wish we just had it on the page, and I'm fine with that too. There's always a choice not to attend a session or not to listen to me on YouTube. But a voice is an invitation.
I would like a CD with the book.
Audio books seem to be on the upswing, don't they?
CD with the book so I can read along and I can hear you and enjoy it as Arundhathi and not try and make it my own poem.
Okay, I will consider that because that has been said more than once. Thank you.
Another question? Hi Arundhathi. I'm a fan already, and I asked this with some risk. I've been thinking all this while, should I ask this question or not? So pardon me if I cause any offense, I don't mean to, but I've generally thought a lot about this. Your poetry is so much at one with yourself, with your whole persona, your personality, as Abhay was also talking about. But I've wondered about, you've done one book with him and one book on Sadhguru. So maybe I haven't explored him enough. but I've heard him, and therefore this question is not about your poetry directly, but because your poetry is springs so much from your personality and your...
You're asking me why I'm with Sadhguru?
No.
Essentially?
No.
Oh.
In a way, kind of. I want you to perhaps explain at least one aspect of his philosophy, which I in fact see is quite opposed to the tradition of bhakti itself, as I see it at least. Whereas in bhakti there is great inclusivity. I've heard Sadhguru speak of outsiders. So, how do you engage with that?
So it's a good question in terms of, the question of why one is with Sadhguru comes back again and again. So let me just say this right away. What is a guru? I think there is a belief, and many people say, are you a follower? And I feel the very word guru, the very word follower, both these are such loaded words that I actually would like to say, I'm very glad you asked the question, because no, I'm not a follower. Is he my spiritual guide? Yes, certainly he is. And does that mean I need to agree with every comment that he makes? Certainly not. Why do I trust this guru? Because he's never asked me to agree with him. Why do I trust this guru? Because he's never asked me to follow him. Why do I trust this guru? Because he's more committed to my freedom than I am myself. To me, those are the signs of a guru. And all the secular mentors I've had who've talked freedom, talked inclusiveness, haven't lived it. This was one who happened to be a guru as well, into inverted commas, who in my experience has lived it, has talked freedom and allowed me that freedom. So I think our trust has developed over the years for various reasons, and he's been present in ways that are too numerous to mention in my life. I have said several things that I've been around many people whom I would consider to be the kind of person we believe we ought to hang around with, which is PLU, right? People like us, I believe. Yeah, so I've hung around with many people like us. And I found myself uncomfortable with myself and sometimes with them for their ability to use certain wonderful abstract nouns, freedom, inclusiveness amongst them, and not live it at all, and not walk that talk. So I'm less interested in what people say. I'm less interested in agreeing with people, because there's absolutely not a person in the world I agree with entirely. Not a person. So I'm not with Sadhguru because I have to agree with him. I'm with Sadhguru because he has been, for me, the person who offered me a key to myself, which went deeper than many other teachers did. There have been other teachers who've opened up worlds of poetry, worlds of art, dance, theater, all the arts that I love. This one offered me a key that went much, much deeper. And I cannot express sufficient gratitude for that. Thank you.
One more question, one last question.
I would like to know about when one spiritually evolves, you open up a lot of inner wisdom and knowledge. Have you gone back to your earlier poems, maybe amongst the first few that you've written, and thought of rewriting it or seen it in a different perception?
That has nothing to do with the spiritual part of things. It has just to do with sometimes with the fact that you wish you could rewrite your poems. Of course we do. We all wish that. But what I think, someone, this question right here in Goa, she said, is your bhakti poetry about reinstating God in a godless world? And I said, not at all. Absolutely not. But what it is about reclaiming a spirit of wonder that I feel is deeply endangered in the world that we live in. For me, reclaiming wonder, the willingness to be surprised, the unwillingness to live in safe cubby holes, the courage to open up to uncertainty, the courage to open up and confess to bewilderment, These are things that the Bhakti poets give us. And that's what I think has changed. And yet, oddly enough, what started me on poetry as a child was wonder. So it actually feels like it's time to reclaim that wonder. Not necessarily write the same way, but reclaim that spirit of wonder, the willingness to be surprised, you know.
Thank you very much, Arundhathi Subramaniam. It is always such a pleasure to hear.